Welcome to State of Reform's virtual series, 5 Slides We're Discussing, with some of healthcare's most thoughtful leaders. And now, the host of State of Reform, DJ Wilson.
All right. Well, welcome to this conversation on genetic disease, rare disease, and gene therapy. My name is DJ Wilson, one of the hosts here at State of Reform, and I sure appreciate you making time to be with us. We've got about 120 of you registered. Not all of you are in the room just yet, but you're getting up there over 100, and I appreciate you making time to be with us. We're, of course, lunchtime here on the West Coast, 3 o'clock on the East Coast, and 2 o'clock in Chicago. We hosted another one of these conversations earlier today. And if you know about us here at State of Reform, you know that we're focused on state level conversations, trying to tee up some of these discussions that need a little more thoughtful engagement, need a safe table around which to gather where we can get left, right, public, private. And the problems we have in front of us, we think require more conversation and not less. So regardless of the outcome. So we're excited to offer or have this one teed up for you with 3 really smart voices talking about this rare disease issue and gene therapy. I want to introduce all 3 here. One is, of course, Jennifer Hodge, who has a PhD and leads the U.S. Rare Neurology Medical Team at Pfizer. Angela Ramirez Holmes, who's the founder of CalRare, and Ryan Fisher, the Chief Advocacy Officer for the Parent Project, Muscular Dystrophy. Thanks to each of you for making time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Jennifer, let me ask you first, what are you spending your mental energy on these days as we reconnect here in November of 2021?
Thank you, DJ, and thank you to the other panelists for the opportunity to get together. I'm an immunologist by training. I've been with Pfizer a little over 10 years, and I lead, as you mentioned, our rare neurology team. In the U.S. Medical Affairs Unit, I'm responsible for getting ready for the U.S. DMD, Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy Gene Therapy Program and launch. So that's what I've been spending my time thinking about, working on, and worrying about.
Yeah, good. Ryan, how about you? What are you spending your mental energy on these days?
Hi, DJ. Thank you for having me. So perhaps a little bit about our organization. Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy is the largest patient advocacy organization fighting to end Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Duchenne is a fatal genetic disease diagnosed in childhood. It's characterized by progressive muscle weakness over time and caused by a mutation in the dystrophin gene. It's a catastrophic diagnosis. Patients typically lose their ability to walk by their mid-teens and often don't live past their 3rd decade. And we were founded by a mother by the name of Pat Furlong. She lost her 2 children, Christopher and Patrick, to the disease. And since our founding has been focused, along with the rest of us, in changing the landscape for Duchenne. And we're making progress. And really that started with the passage of a major piece of legislation called the MD Care Act. We also fund several research strategies, including gene therapies, and we now have 5 FDA approvals. So as an organization, we're focused on really, moving the needle and continuing to change lives for patients. That's why I'm really excited to be here to talk about gene therapy with everyone.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ryan. And Angela, tell us about the work that you're doing that is commanding your attention these days.
I'm the founder and president of the California Action League for Rare Diseases, or CalRare, but mostly I'm a rare mom. And so in my spare time, CalRare is dedicated to improving the lives of rare disease patients in California. And we're a coalition of rare disease stakeholders with a goal to raise awareness regarding rare diseases. Our first project was starting a state legislative rare disease caucus. And 25% of the California state legislature is now a member of that caucus. And our goal is really to bring public and legislative awareness, educate legislators and staff about rare disease policy issues, and ensure patients have a voice in shaping policy. So what I spend my energy on is trying to make sure patients have a seat at the table. And there are so many issues for rare disease patients that there are not enough hours in the day, but we do our best to try to make an impact for rare disease patients.
Yeah, well, good. I appreciate all of you making time to be with us. And for those in our virtual room here, I appreciate you being with us as well. We will, of course, take your questions, those that you can post in the chat box on the right of the screen. we'll try to integrate those questions into our conversation here as we work through our discussion. The framework of this discussion is 5 slides. And so each of our guests has brought a slide. We've contributed 2. And so those 5 slides tee up a couple of different topics that we think are worth wrestling to the ground for a few minutes at least, to try to dig into them in this multimedia space in which we find ourselves in this pandemic era. So without further ado, I want to jump right into our first slide. This is one that we've teed up here from State of Reform and added to the mix. And the reason I like this slide is because it is pointing to the, at least linguistic oxymoron, that rare diseases are in fact relatively common. That 1 in 10 folks in the country is dealing with some genetic or rare disease, or almost 1 in 10. And even though there may be a small, narrow population with any one rare disease, the number of folks as a percentage of our population dealing with rare disease is really quite considerable. So as more genetic therapies and large molecule medicines and other, medicines come to market to address these diseases, the policy implications are going to be stark, not only for cost, but also ultimately for access. So we think of this conversation as really a horizon level, a horizon event, meaning these are very forward-looking conversations thinking about policy, but truth be told, the rare disease population, or the population dealing with rare diseases, is already quite large in here. So Jennifer, when you see this as somebody who works and lives in rare disease professionally all of the time, I wonder what keeps you up at night. What are the things that you get worried about, or things that you are thinking about that make it hard to go to sleep sometimes?
Mm-hmm. I think the first thing I thought of when I saw this slide is the far right box, so that the most rare diseases will have a genetic component. I think as someone in medicine development at Pfizer, and previously as a bench scientist in immunology, that's how we think as scientists, is what is the root cause of this disease? What is the mechanism, so that I can think about how I can target it, and by virtue of that, make a medicine. So I think that's why we're here today talking about rare disease and gene therapy, with a genetic mechanism or the blueprint of that disease being in the genes. Now I know how to go target it, and we can talk about that with gene therapy. Having said that, you would think that is the easiest part of this whole thing, is making the medicine. There is so much more once we have a medicine. Then you're talking about delivery and administration, logistics, access, policy, cost, monitoring of a very powerful science and new technology that we're still day in and day out understanding as we go. So that's kind of what keeps me up at night. The part about making the medicine and in a clinical trial, even at Pfizer, that's kind of almost the simple part in the whole grand scheme of the thing. So there's a lot to be done.
Angela, how about you? Other than being a parent, so I'm sure kids keep you up, and certainly a rare mom, what keeps you up at night when you think about this work?
Well, the supermajority of rare diseases do have a genetic component, but also the supermajority have no FDA-approved treatments. And so that's what keeps me up at night, the fact that we know this and innovation is here and coming, but we are ready for cures. And that is what keeps me working.
Yeah. Ryan, how about you, to just round this out? What gives you anxiety about this work? I mean, there's a lot of hopefulness in this work, I imagine, but what kind of drives you from the anxiety side of things?
Yeah, following up on what Angela was saying, we work with a lot of the broader rare disease coalitions. We partner to sort of educate them on the models that we put in place for characterizing the disease and really forming a regulatory pathway. But truth is, really, since pathways like the accelerated approval pathway has been into place, it has not been used for rare diseases as much as for, say, cancer and HIV. So Duchenne has been lucky to be able to take advantage of this pathway through our drug developers. But I think what keeps me up at night is for all those other rare diseases, 95% of them that have no treatment. Will there be a pathway for them to even get approval? And I think that's why we're working at the federal level to encourage flexibility out of the agency. And then eventually we hope for these treatments to be approved and then get access.
Jennifer, I imagine I think I know that science is like many other experiences, that there are big spikes of progress and then plateaus, and then spikes of progress and plateaus. It feels like, and maybe this is just because of the pandemic and the mRNA vaccines, that we are in a period of real progress in terms of science, and it seems like it's much more rapid across all disease states, including cancer and HIV. Is that accurate? Is this a time of like actually major once in a generation progress, or should we consider this to be the new normal?
No, I hope it's the new normal, and that we're always in this state of rapid progress and excitement. I think, if you had asked me, and I don't want to date myself, some 30 years ago, why I went into immunology and why I was interested in gene therapy and things like that, I don't know, but man, was I lucky to be able to take this opportunity to be part of such a monumental movement in science. I think we've learned a lot, we've studied a lot, and we're finally getting to the point where we're starting to hopefully put it into practice. And I think that the time has come to now see that across many diseases. I think that the part that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle is the amount of work behind the scenes to take things to development, to be even a target or an investigation or what have you. There's a lot of behind the scenes that will never see the light of day for whatever reason, but now it's a great time to be part of it, and I hope it continues. I hope so.
So Ryan, as you think about this from an advocacy perspective, if the science is going to potentially continue to outpace the policy conversation for some time, and that the science will broaden into areas where policy conversations have not yet entered, do we have the right kind of framework to think about these? I mean, if we're not keeping up with the science now in terms of our policy conversations, our policy frameworks, do we need some sort of generational change or quantum leap forward in how we regulate and manage this oncoming sort of bow wave of science?
Well, I mean, I think that if we take a step back, I think it's difficult first to balance hope and expectations when it comes to gene therapy for many communities. Even in the name, how many therapies have therapy in the title? Gene therapy sort of invokes this is the answer to all genetic diseases. But I think we first have to look at making sure that as disease communities, we are building the tools necessary to characterize our diseases and to talk to payers, everybody in our ecosystem, about what's needed to make decisions. So I think we have to all be in this together. I think it is moving fast, but we mapped the genome 20 years ago, and I think a lot has happened in a few decades, but there's a lot of work to be done on simply characterizing some of these diseases in order to understand how effective these gene therapies are to begin with.
Angela, how would you characterize these conversations, since you're advocating directly with legislators? I assume legislators want to be supportive of kids, regardless of who, they just want to be supportive of kids. But that when you get to things like price tags, that sometimes they have questions that they didn't have before. How would you characterize the willingness and then how far that willingness will extend of legislators with whom you work?
So government is always behind innovation. We know this, and that's why we always advocate for, we've got to figure it out and then bring them solutions. That's how it works. So that's why we're all working so hard and getting no sleep. But like in California, whole genome sequencing, innovative, right? Well, we got a pilot project 3 years ago in California, funded by the budget, and $2 million by the California budget to start a pilot project about whole genome sequencing and undiagnosed babies, sick babies. And that pilot project saved lives. Never mind the results that were going to come. So what was on our plate was proving that it was both clinically excellent for patients, but also that it would save money in the long run by providing a diagnosis, cutting out the diagnostic odyssey, and having results focused on really this precision medicine initiative that has taken hold in California. Those are the kind of things we need to do more of to show that it works. Yes, everyone wants to be supportive of kids. We certainly can't forget about the 50% of rare patients that are adults. And we also want to make sure that we're presenting things not just as save lives, we know we have to provide that other component that is also going to work for government. That's our challenge.
Diagnostic odyssey. That's a great term. I think none of us want to go through that regardless of our disease state. Jennifer, why don't you walk us through the slide that you've brought? Tell us what you've got teed up here.
Sure. So, and just a point, because I was thinking of what Ryan said. So I was going to start off with my discussion of the promise of gene therapy for rare disease and how we would begin with the unmet need. But I think just a word on the concept of gene therapy as I have it here. So gene therapy, from a basic science perspective, is just a therapy that addresses the gene or that has, some target in the gene. And so it really, to your point about evolving science and the innovations in science, it's almost like an umbrella term nowadays, because there's so many different kinds of gene therapy. There's cell and gene therapy, there's in vivo gene therapy, there's ex vivo gene therapy, there's CRISPR and all the others. So I just want to be clear on that it really, the science is moving fast. And I think it's times like this where we come together and discuss and create awareness that we'll get to the right place. But just thinking about the unmet needs, I think we talked a little bit about it in your opening slide. And what I always like to show when I speak are the numbers, the 7,000 rare diseases across the world. I'm still, frankly disappointed that we have this whopping 95% with limited to no approved treatment options. And it really, if you think about it, makes the rare disease patient population collectively one of the most underserved communities in medicine today. And that, frankly, is just still unacceptable to me. An estimated half of those affected are children, as we talked about. And most importantly, as we talked about, 80% are rooted in the genetics. Finally, I'll say, as we don't have to say here, but the need for innovation in this particular space is extremely urgent. And so when we look at the potential impact in the center of my slide, the potential is really to kind of get at the underlying cause of that rare disease at the root and at the gene, not at the symptoms, not to provide supportive care and options of that nature, but really at the underlying biology of the disease. And so I've listed just a couple ideas for potential impact. And one on the left is that a potential treatment where there is nothing right now or less treatments, the potential obviously to reduce the enormous costs and burden and the potential to improve someone's life, not just the patients, but the caregivers and the families that are living with them, the quality of that life. And I will add that, ultimately it's to realize the full potential of gene therapy to treat rare disease depends on listening and addressing the needs of the patient. And I like to say that, at least in my team meetings, and I know at others at Pfizer, we always like to say that we've left an empty chair for the patient. And a little harder in the virtual room, but it was something that I did in the office, because it's something you have to keep top of mind in everything you do, at least I think, to always say in my head, what would the patient think? What would the mom think? What would they want me to say right here? And then lastly, on the bottom, I kind of put down some of the challenges that I had top of mind, because, gene therapy may seem straightforward in its principle, but it's really a powerful science. It's scientifically complex and in practice as well. And we need to think about, what does that look like in terms of the care system, the infrastructure that's required? What does care look like now, and then plus gene therapy, and start to think through the practicalities of that. Think through access, the who, the what, the when, the how. And then lastly, dealing with all the uncertainties of a powerful science that we continue to learn about every day. I mean, we think of ourselves as detectives, so we're acting as a detective, if you will, in this evolving science and medicine of gene therapy. And so we have to deal with some uncertainties and put together the clues. And so I'll pause there.
So Jennifer, the 7,000 rare diseases worldwide that you mentioned on your slide here, I'm assuming that many of those have been recently named, maybe discovered in the last 20 or 30 years. Is that accurate?
What was your descriptor there? Did you say several, many, some?
Yeah,
I think it's hard to classify the 7,000 into, I got to be careful on my adjective of how you described it, but I think it's fair to say that there are some that we have more awareness of than others. There are some that, could be in the rare disease group of 7,000. And we have 2 case studies, 2 patients that have been reported. It kind of runs the spectrum. I will say that the science, it's not just the disease and defined and named and you then have to characterize the clinical manifestations. You then have to go back to the kind of root cause, as we talked about. Something like I was working in sickle cell for a while. We've known about sickle cell for over 100 years. To Angela's point, 100 years. So
and we don't have it solved yet.
Nope.
Angela, how about your experience with legislators? Just give us an insight when you're talking to them. How sophisticated are some of them in your conversations? Because these are relatively new and relatively sophisticated conversations in many instances.
Well, as with anything, we're a citizen legislature, so we run the gamut from people who have absolutely zero science background to leading rare disease pediatricians. And so what I see is they often look to the experts. And so that's terrific when we have named experts of things. We have some doctors and some that are part of our caucus that are, recognized for their expertise and look to be a leader. Part of the piece of bringing the caucus together was that we wanted to tell legislators, you don't have to know anything about rare diseases to care and to frankly start to address the biggest public health crisis that you probably have never heard of. And so what we said is, you don't have to know anything, just come on, we'll give you the information. And that was part of the impetus for us starting the caucus, because the one at the federal level has worked so well for education and understanding. And we have to start educating legislators who don't know and don't have any background about this amazing technology and innovation and the science that's happening, frankly, right here in our state of California, and what they're doing and how they can help patients who live in their districts. We're talking about 10% of the population. That means we're talking about nearly 4 million Californians. 10% of their own district are affected by this. And so it's just about letting them know that rare isn't so rare and that they don't have to know anything, but we'd happily help them find the answers and find out about it. And that's really what our goal is.
So Ryan, in your advocacy conversations, what are the obstacles that you run into in terms of, just getting a legislator to kind of get their hands around all of this? Is it the complexity of the science? Is it that there are too many other things in the ether to break through? What are the obstacles that stand in the way between you and success in some of the advocacy conversations?
I think you're amazing.
So much about advocacy is consistency over time and returning and engaging. There are so many issues for them to be paying attention to. But when you're consistent and your advocates have a consistent message, that seems to have the biggest impact. We've been able to create champions as legislators who have taken on our cause. And we have the longest running rare disease advocacy conference at the federal level in the US, which really is only because we go back every single year. We have these conversations. And obviously members turn over and you have to start from scratch sometimes. But you have to advocate from home, you have to advocate in person. And to me, at the end of the day, those obstacles are overcome by that consistency.
It's in some cases, it's like anything, right? You got to be steady and you got to show up, and some more things change. Sometimes more things do not. Angela, let's turn now to your slide. Walk us through what you've brought to the conversation.
Great, thank you so much. So enrollment in Medi-Cal surged in the wake of the enactment of the Affordable Care Act. And so since 2011, Medi-Cal annually pays for approximately 50% of all births in California. Medi-Cal covers 1/3 of the total state population. And I show this graphic because most find it surprising, but also with nearly 4 million rare disease patients in California, we know that policy solutions will be needed. And if we don't address the people that are covered by Medi-Cal, we will leave behind, we will miss that piece of access for patients. We know the rare disease community is desperate for cures. You've seen the numbers that so many are without a treatment. We all see the promise of gene therapy. but we're worried about our ability to access it. Innovation's amazing, but only if patients can access the treatments. In order to keep that focus on cures and patient access, we must all come together and address a host of challenges. And Jennifer started to talk about some of them. We need more diagnoses. We do this through genetic testing, whole genome sequencing, newborn screening. I mentioned our whole genome sequencing pilot project, which came to be known as Project Baby Bear. And that not only brought a lot more data into the system for work in gene therapy, but also started the process to diagnose patients. We need to figure out who pays and how. This is the biggest, as numbers get bandied about, this is the biggest stressor for patients. And there will be associated regulations and policies at both the federal and the state level. Again, talking about education and understanding. In order to legislate certain regulations, we need to educate legislators on why this is important, why this matters, and why certain things are great and certain things are not in these regulations. And with more focus on value framework, how do we demonstrate that rare disease lives are worthy of treatment? And this has been an ongoing fight with ICER and those kinds of things. We need to be able to demonstrate that rare disease lives matter, and that treatment, spending money on treatment also matters. And so that is where we get conversations, very uncomfortable conversations in the rare community about the value of life. And then there's, we have no uniformity in healthcare policy coverage or criteria. And this causes great concern, as patients often many have insurance with their jobs. They might change jobs. How do we make sure that patients get what they need in a changing environment with no uniform criteria? This is a huge challenge for us that we have to talk about. And then with those Medi-Cal stats, we come back to how to ensure equitable access for patients. And we need to have these specific and actionable conversations now as the therapies are being produced. I love when Jennifer talks about having a seat at the table for patients and keeping front of mind what patients might want to, what they might feel about a particular thing. And I think that's important, but we're developing this technology now. And some of these conversations, particularly about the roadmap, have lagged a little bit. And we have smart people in this space, and we have got to get a roadmap focused on cures and patient access.
Great stuff. I know there's a lot baked into that. Jennifer, I wonder what you are thinking when you see this slide and hear Angela's comments.
I love this slide. I think that the thing I could say so much, but the thing I'll start with is the roadmap. I agree with you. And that's what I kind of was trying to get at, my answer to what keeps me up at night. It's that we need to get a plan. We can develop a great technology through the years. We can put it into practice as a technology in a specific disease in a clinical trial, but that's not delivering to the patients. We need to put together a roadmap of how we get to delivery, and it's access. It's like all the things I said, the infrastructure that's going to be needed. How many boys and girls, anything that's going to be required to be treated? Do we have enough physicians? Do we have enough expertise? Do we have enough facilities? Do we have the payer, the policies? I mean, I could go on. We need to have a roadmap, and we need to get people on board on our team and on the journey.
So Ryan, as we think about this roadmap and we think about how every state has to develop its own map and then work down that roadway as best it can, give us some context for how you see California compared to other states. Is it a leader? In what way is it a leader? What are some other states California might look to learn from?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that as someone who doesn't live in California, I rely on our advocates and people like Angela and patients within California to communicate what exactly is going on in the state. I think that there are some good points and there's some worrisome areas. And I'll speak about this on my slide. We've seen some positive trends when it comes to access to newly approved therapies. but we've been disappointed to see what's going on with the Rare Disease Advisory Council. So, I mean, it's a mixed bag. We do want to highlight when things are positive for our community, our constituents, and we need to press on the things that still need work.
If I may add from my perspective, again, I don't live in California either, but I look at it from a scientific medical perspective. You have fantastic science, medicine, institutional assets, if you will, in the state of California that is just fantastic. So I think that is a great place for us to start as well.
Good. Let's jump to our next slide. And of course, this is one that Ryan, you've teed up for us. Why don't you walk us through what you brought to the conversation?
Yeah, thank you. When I thought about this topic of gene therapy, I really thought about the theme of embracing opportunity as it relates to the work we're doing at PPMD. I think it's first that we recognize we're really part of one drug development ecosystem. It's essentially a community of stakeholders living in conjunction with other components of their environment, all interacting as one system. We have to recognize that and recognize the needs of all stakeholders within that ecosystem. And when thinking about California, I have immediately thought about what we're seeing with the first FDA approvals in Duchenne, and state Medicaid leadership really did seem to understand the value of engaging with clinical experts in our disease. So those experts in our ecosystem who know the disease best and treat these patients. And as a result, we have seen rational access policies for these therapies that treat patients across the spectrum of disease, and a way to monitor the effectiveness of those treatments through clinical data collection. We believe that engagement should start now when it comes to gene therapy, about what data is going to be needed to satisfy all stakeholders within the ecosystem. And that brings me to the second part of my slide, which is data. Of course, data is the language of drug development in healthcare, and we're now in a place where, thanks to technology, we have this ability to use data in different ways and improve how it's collected, shared, and ultimately analyzed. Advocacy and legislation through 21st Century Cures mandated new rules around data sharing. It allows for more access and interoperability of health IDT systems. I think some of those institutions are still getting caught up on the fact that if a patient wants to consent that their data be used, there are now laws to say that should happen. It prevents the blocking of that health data and electronic health records, so that if they do consent to a third party, like a patient advocacy organization, it should be used to advance the research and understanding of that condition. And rare disease, this is so critical. We need to unsilo the data that exists in institutions to understand what's happening. And this is only going to benefit us with gene therapy, where there's going to be long-term follow-up. We need to understand what is the natural history, and then what is gene therapy doing in comparison. So finally, the last part of my slide is on patient-focused drug development. I think we've made incredible progress when it comes to ensuring that patients are at the table, and this has been shared by others in the group. We've made progress through legislation in the regulatory space. FDA is taking a much more transparent and structured approach to incorporating patient perspectives into their decision-making. Companies are engaging patients in different ways and collecting what's called patient experience data. And we see opportunity for this engagement across the space, but we need to achieve a better balance when it comes to after these therapies are approved. Why aren't payers engaging patients and patient groups and patient advocacy more deliberately? And we should be having these conversations right now instead of after the approval, when the data and the information is going to be needed.
So in a different conversation, Ryan, not with you, but a conversation we hosted focused on Illinois healthcare and Midwest issues, one of the groups, one of our panelists from the Midwest Business Group on Health, cited that her employer members, when thinking about healthcare costs, that their number one concern was specialized pharmacy, and that the number one thing they were spending their time on was managing specialized pharmacy costs. As I don't think of you as a CFO, but as an advocate, when you are having these conversations, where does payment of these fit in terms of maybe a value-based or some sort of unique payment methodology, so that your ask is not simply that Medicaid or others should just pay these bills, but that there might be some creative solutions to getting around these financing challenges. Thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm glad we're all having these conversations now to look at innovative models. I do think outcomes-based payment models are appropriate and should be explored if these gene therapies are meant to dramatically slow disease progression, for instance. If patients aren't going to reach a certain milestone, I think we should be looking at what is the pricing scheme or arrangement associated with that. The truth is, this variability in all our patient populations and all these gene therapies might not have the same impact on every single patient. It is a appropriate conversation to have, but what I worry about the conversation is patient groups and patient advocates and patients themselves are put in the middle of the debate between the companies and the payers. And often I think that's unfair, each wanting us to attack the other. So let's all get together instead and have a frank conversation about what's reasonable going forward. And let's do it earlier in the process than later when it comes to things like gene therapy.
I would love for patients to actually exit out of that. I want the providers to talk to the payers, tell them how much it's going to cost, tell them that, give them the data. Patients are really not, they have a lot of concerns. I'm not sure they're the best people to be weighing into this decision other than how it affects them. And I think what needs to be more perhaps talked about is that, these treatments don't happen really in a vacuum. You either provide treatments or you pay ongoing medical costs. It isn't one or the other. It's not something that, this treatment is so expensive. Well, so is ongoing medical costs over a lifetime. And the innovation that we're seeing is able to really affect that ongoing cost and even get to the point where we're talking about cures, which obviously is the ultimate goal. And so I think that we sometimes talk about it in a way that's not really most helpful. Like, we have to talk about, look, well, if you don't provide it, you still have to pay a bunch of money because there are still ongoing costs regarding medical care for people with these chronic conditions. So I think that's an important part of the conversation.
And Angela, to that point, I think that we also need to look, language is something that I think is so important here. And if the perception is that cure is going to mean reversing all disease course completely, and that patient is going to go back to what they perceive to be their normal life or what a normal peer looks like, I think that's not correct. I think that we need to look at what do patients value and what do they feel is a valuable treatment in terms of gene therapy, and have those discussions.
And I think there's a range of outcomes that we also need to acknowledge that, some treatments, Jennifer was getting into more of the technical, which is, some treatments are not necessarily all the way to cures. And so there's going to be different outcomes for different treatments. And so that's the other issue with talking about things as an umbrella, right? Is that there are so many things under the umbrella.
And if I may add, I think to 2 points to tie together. I think to your point about the payer discussions or even any audience discussion, I think it really behooves us to have conversations like this where we say, first off, this is the disease. This is the progression of the disease. I don't know that everyone knows that before we then come in with, and then this is the gene therapy and da, 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 da. And then to your second point, and these are the outcomes that are meaningful. I mean, we can have clinical outcomes, a measure of this, that, and the other thing, but what's meaningful to the patient as well. And then the last piece is, do they know in that progression of that disease, all the different costs associated at every step as a family member, as a physician, as a multidisciplinary care specialist, like those kind of educational, I think would go a long way. And my last point is, and the data is needed to have those as well, because anytime we do something, I'm a scientist, you got to bring the evidence, you got to bring the data to support it.
I want to use that as a segue to our last slide here. And this is one that we've contributed to the conversation. This breaks down different types of medicines and talks about their status in the sort of preclinical research and stage and testing and launch. And you can see, if you look at the far right graph or the far right bar, the little sort of light blue at the top is all of the gene therapies that are currently launched and in the market. And then as a share of all the medicines. And then the one just next to it on the left, the number of gene therapies that are in the clinical research stage and the preclinical research stage, you can see there's a multifold factorial increase in these gene therapies that are coming to market or in the process of getting worked through to market. And so going back to our original frame with our first slide, the medicines for rare disease are going to become much more common. These conversations about payment are going to become much more common. And as a commons in our government, state and federal, we're going to have to come to terms with how to think about paying for some of these medicines. And for the most part, reflected in our conversation here today, there are really only two places money for these comes from. They either come from tax dollars or premium dollars. Very few dollars come from any place else. People aren't paying cash on the barrel, so to speak, for most of these dollars. So, Jennifer, when you see this, I wonder what your thoughts are when you reflect upon the sort of bow wave of medicines likely coming through the process to market.
Two things. As a developer and a scientist in the lab, and now at a company that develops, I think that kind of what I alluded to earlier, there's a lot behind the scenes that needs to go on to really characterize these medicines before they're ready to hit the launch space. So you'll see a lot of work that maybe doesn't come to fruition. We always have to keep the patient first and foremost in terms of measuring the safety, the unexpected, keeping our eyes open. And so there's definitely a movement, and it won't be a one-to-one for sure. We always used to say 30 shots on goal to get one to the next step. The other thing that kind of alluding to what keeps me up at night is the US ready for this? I mean, we can build, but we need to be ready. And especially with COVID, I get very nervous that we're not quite ready, whether it's from a financial perspective, an institutional perspective, you name it. The last 2 years of COVID has been really difficult on the healthcare system, and it has cost quite a bit of money. And so it's just the perfect storm, if you will, to have this advent in gene therapy starting out.
Ryan, what are your thoughts when you see this slide?
I think that we're still learning a lot when it comes to gene therapy. I'm glad that there's a lot of excitement in the development space when it comes to emerging gene therapies, but these therapies are not without risks. And to Jennifer's point, there's a lot of uncertainty that remains. I don't want to see therapies in the other spaces decrease so dramatically and innovation dry up, because the other piece of this is that for those gene therapies that are not curative, we are going to have combination therapies. And I know that's a scary thing to think about when it comes from payers, but when it comes to the patient community, these aren't one and done in many cases. They are hopefully going to dramatically change disease course, but we still are going to have to figure out how to layer on therapies like they had to do with the HIV and cancers. So I think that these are hard discussions, but to Jennifer's point, we have to prepare and figure out ways to provide access to patients.
Jennifer, let me ask you to go back to this slide for a second. And when you look at the far left column there, that is the column that represents the absolute number of therapies and medicines that are in the preclinical stage. And, it really is collapsing. I think that was a word that Ryan just used. I'm wondering, is there a crowding out that's taking place somewhere? What is the rationale, or why do we not have enough government support for research? Are there allocations of funds towards other higher margin drugs or therapies? Why do we see such a collapse there?
I'd have to look more at the source of it. It looks like it's a McKinsey report. Is the far left preclinical thousands of asset indication pairs?
I mean, it's suggesting that we don't have very many therapies and medicines in the pipeline in the earlier stage, that we've got a lot going on in clinical, but in the preclinical, we don't have much.
You're asking a scientist without the evidence to support, to provide a theory. But the one thing that comes to mind when I see something like that is we think about, one target, or one, if you will, medicine or asset in development can be put into trial in multiple ways for multiple disease areas based on the mechanisms. And so you may have X that looks really good in the lab, and you understand its basic mechanism in Y, but Y is a factor in 21 diseases, and we're going to test it in different ways, and different companies are going to do it at different institutions. So there's also a little bit of that. And I think you've seen that even in the COVID world, where you looked at our arsenal of drugs that are approved and that are generic. Can we repurpose anything? If we understand the mechanism, can you go back and look? And so there may be some of that going in. But I will say, as a basic scientist, completely, research is very underfunded.
Yeah.
These days, as someone who left the NIH funding world, very, very underfunded.
Mm-hmm. I want to spend a minute as we begin to round the bend for the home stretch here, asking each of you, about what gives you hope. Like, what we started the conversation talking about what keeps you up at night, but I want to get to this more hopeful place. So what gives you hope? What keeps you putting, your pants on one leg at a time in the morning, getting you out of bed and getting you out to do the work? And Angela, let me start with you. What gives you hope as you do this work?
Well, my hope is in that people are becoming more aware of rare diseases, that we're talking more about science these days, for good and bad, I guess. Talking more about science. We're talking more about the importance of science in and curing and or thinking about diseases. I think that's all amazing innovation. I mean, when I first sort of came into this space and learned about all of the things that were happening, it's just really eye-opening for me. But also that there is a place for us to play. There's policy, patients can impact policy that can save lives. And that's what gives me hope and keeps me going, is there are things that we can do to impact where government spends its money, and how we can do that. The last chart you showed, some of those are government incentivized pipelines. Orphan drug development based on federal legislation has improved. Those are the things that are hopeful for me.
Ryan, how about you? What gives you hope as you do this work?
So, I think it's simply the resiliency and the collaborative nature of the rare disease community, not just our community, but the way in which we share learnings and try to help each other so that we can learn from our own mistakes and really help others along the way. That coupled with, two emerging things in drug development, one being increase in patient engagement and them having their rightful seat at the table when it comes to developing therapies. I've heard the saying that they've gone from passengers to co-pilots, and can't be a bumper sticker. We have to demonstrate that what patients are saying and what means most to them is incorporated into the decision-making and into the drug development process. So, those are the things that keep me going and get me out of bed.
I would be remiss if I didn't point out, Ryan, the amazing suit of armor behind you. Tell us about how you came to acquire that unique piece. And obviously you put it behind you for a reason. I want to honor the thoughtfulness that went into it.
I wish it was that thoughtful. My husband and I went to dinner. I was a little tipsy. I said, let's go to Home Goods. And I walked out with a $60 night. And then I had nowhere to put it. And it ended up in my office. So I wish I had more of a plan, but that's
Ryan, you're going to have to come up with a better story than that.
It's the truth.
Well, it's a great piece. I love it. We should all get a $60 suit of armor at Home Goods. I can't imagine that's what it costs to make in inflation adjusted terms. In any case, Jennifer, what gives you hope as you do this work?
My parents were school teachers. My dad was a biology teacher. I used to hang out in the back of the classroom. So just that we're talking about science in gene therapy, and every time I talk with patients and physicians, it's incredibly exciting, the world we live in right now. I feel hope, like we're gonna move mountains, and I just think that's a great thing to work on. That's a great thing to be a part of. And so it makes me get up every morning excited to see what today's brings.
That's a great line. Keep at it, because we are going to move mountains. Thank you very much, Jennifer Hodge, the lead for U.S. Rare Neurology Medical Team at Pfizer. Ryan Fisher, the Chief Advocacy Officer for the Parent Project for Muscular Dystrophy, and Angela Ramirez Holmes, the founder of CalRare. I appreciate it. And to the 100 plus of you who are in the room with us here today, I appreciate you making time. We'll have this up on our site at State of Reform and send it out to our email list at 5 Things We're Watching. I appreciate you putting wind in our sails here at State of Reform. We'll have more conversations like this soon. Take care.